Now, you testified before that your son, while he was in Baltimore, was in a program at Johns Hopkins, correct?
Correct.
And your son had previously graduated college from an online school, correct?
For his bachelor's, yes.
And he had been to several different undergraduate schools, correct?
He did.
And he ultimately finished his education with an online program, correct?
I believe he received his associates from the county college and then the bachelor's from Ashford.
So you testified about a time period where you were caring for Corey, correct?
Yes.
And during that time period, you would be the person who would go through Corey's book bag, correct?
I'd be one of the people that went through his book bag.
And you would be the person who would get him off of the bus, correct?
Generally.
And you would be the person who would be checking his schoolwork, correct?
One of the people.
Okay. And you testified at a previous hearing, correct?
I did.
And in that previous hearing, although you're testifying now that you were responsible for all of these things, you couldn't recall what school grade Corey was in, correct?
At that time, that's correct.
And if you were the person doing all of these things, then your son wasn't doing those things in terms of being so involved in Corey's education, correct?
No, it's not correct.
So your son was more involved in Corey's education than you were?
I really didn't assign a percentage of who was more responsible. I took it as when I dealt with his schoolwork that I was 100% responsible in understanding where he was in his classes, what his assignments were, what he was struggling with, and what he was doing well with. That information was passed to my son as soon as he got home and in very many discussions so that he could pick it up and go through the same work that I did and understand all the things I just mentioned.
Okay, but you were actually the person physically going through his book bag then, correct?
I was one of the people.
Right, and you're also the person you testified before who got him off the school bus, correct?
Generally, I did, yes.
Okay. So, based upon what you said then, you would agree that you were pretty integral in terms of caring for Corey while he lived in your house, correct?
Absolutely.
And then during August, right, the defendant and his son moved away from your home, correct?
That's true.
And at that point in time, they actually moved to Barnegat, right?
They did.
And they moved to the Atlantic Heights complex in Barnegat, correct?
They did.
And when your son moved with your grandson, at that point in time, you would have been less involved in Corey's care and education, correct?
Yes.
And that would be because you weren't with him every day, correct?
That's correct.
And at that point in time, it would have been your son's responsibility on his own to care for Corey, correct?
Correct.
Because you weren't there every day anymore, correct?
No.
And he would be solely responsible for going into his backpack, correct?
Correct.
And he would be solely responsible for making sure that he got picked up from school, correct?
Correct.
And he no longer had your guidance and your assistance at that point because he was no longer living with you, correct?
Are you referring to Corey?
I'm referring to your son.
I would give him all the verbal assistance I could every time we talked on the phone in terms of how he was doing and what the plan was to help him.
Right, but you were no longer physically there to actually assist in this, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So I'm going to take you to March 22nd, I believe, is the date that you testified about. And on that day, you and your wife went down to Barnegat, correct?
We did.
And you saw your son that day, correct?
Correct.
And you saw Corey that day, correct?
We did.
And you spent a few hours with your son, and you spent a few hours with Corey, right?
Correct.
And your wife noticed that Corey had a bruise on his forehead, correct?
He did.
And did you see the bruise located on Corey's forehead?
I did.
And during the course of this case, on April 2nd of 2021, after Corey passed, you spoke to Detective Mitchell with the prosecutor's office, right?
I did.
And you gave him a pretty long statement, correct?
It was.
And when you were speaking to the detective, nowhere did you tell him that Corey had this bruise when you saw him on the 22nd, correct?
I don't believe I mentioned it.
And with all of your training that you just talked about and being a police officer and in Homeland Security, this wasn't important for you to mention when you were talking to the detective, correct?
I didn't think it was any more significant than him telling me he fell in the treadmill.
Okay. So Corey told you that he fell on the treadmill?
It was a joint discussion at dinner.
Okay. And again, this wasn't important to you at that time?
Well, it was important that he had a scrape on his forehead,
Okay.
but I didn't think to mention it to Detective Mitchell.
Okay. Now, calling your attention to April 2nd, you spoke to your son while you were driving down to the hospital in Stafford, correct?
Correct.
And when you spoke to your son while you were driving to the hospital, you told your son that you were going to contact the police, correct?
I did.
And that was based upon conversations that you had with your son on that day, correct?
It was.
And when you got to the hospital, after you had told your son that you were going to contact the police, your son wasn't there at the hospital, correct?
He wasn't in the emergency room now.
And when you got to the hospital, Corey was there by himself without any family member, correct?
That's correct. They wouldn't let my wife and I in.
Right. And your son, though, he was not with Corey when you got to the hospital, right?
No.
And in the time between from when your son left until you got there, Corey was alone in the hospital without any family members, correct?
As far as I know.
And when you got to the hospital and your son is not there, you were trying to find him, correct?
Correct.
And you were basically telling him to come back, correct?
When I did talk to him, I told him he needed to come back.
Right. And in fact, you didn't even talk to your son again until the following day, correct?
That's correct.
And that would have been on April 3rd, correct?
Yes.
And let's say the night of April 2nd, you didn't talk to your son, correct?
I didn't talk to him now.
And you didn't know where he was the night of April 2nd, correct?
I didn't know.
And then the morning of April 3rd, you didn't speak to your son, correct?
No.
And you didn't know where he was the morning of April 3rd, correct?
No.
And then finally, on April 3rd, your son calls you, correct?
Correct.
And when he called you, he was in Arkansas, correct?
That's what I believe, and I believe it from looking at the phone log. I don't remember him telling me he was in Arkansas.
But it's your understanding, based upon what you reviewed, that he was in Arkansas, correct?
That's what I believe.
Okay. And then you're the person who told your son to come back, correct?
We all did.
And you told him that he needed to get home from Arkansas, correct?
Correct.
Now, the next time you saw your son would have been on April 5th, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, that summer, your son and his now girlfriend, what's her name?
Laura.
Okay. So that summer, your son and Laura actually went on a hiking trip, correct?
They did.
And that would have been a few months after Corey passed?
3 months.
And the two of them went hiking in the Appalachian trails, correct?
They were in Pennsylvania. I think it was the Appalachian Trail.
And they also went on a van trip up in Maine. Isn't that correct?
I don't recall that.
But they spent time traveling together, correct?
That was, yes,
And that only would have been a few months after Corey's passing, correct?
August is 3 months after he passed, yes.
Thank you, Judge. No further questions.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Gregor, on cross-examination, Ms. Lento asked you if anybody was with Corey when you were on your way down to Southern Ocean Hospital, right?
Yes,
Okay. On your way from Monroe to Barnegat, were you aware that Corey had already passed?
yes.
Thank you.
No further questions, Judge.
All right, sir, thank you. You're excused. Councilman, I see it, side reference.